Hey, this is Bob from INSYDIUM. In this training video, we'll recreate this really cool scene, and this is obviously a mix of fluid types. We have got a granular solve for our snow sculpture collapsing, and we have a liquid solve for our water gushing into this scene. So there's loads of really cool stuff going on in here. Let's not waste any more time. We'll fire up Cinema 4D and we'll get started. In our scene then, we have this cube primitive, which is our floor object. It's a really large cube, look, 6,000 by 6,000. That's going to be our collider floor. We've got our Cinema 4D bust. You can find this in the content browser. And if we just go to the bust, to the coordinates manager button here, we can look at the size. We've actually increased this. We've scaled it up until the Y is just over 160 centimeters, just if you want to make that match. All right, and so there's going to be two simulations here, our sand and our water. Let's get the sand first, and you can render that as sand or snow. Let's go to the emitters tab and we'll create an emitter. Here it is. And in the object tab, you know the drill by now. We need the emitter shape to be this object. So we put it in object mode, and then we drag in the object we want to emit from into this link field. So let's drag in our bust into there, and we'll just make that bust invisible now. Let's go to the emission tab. We want a shot of particles on the first frame. The shot type, we're going to use the granular mode, which is hexagonal grid. We want to remove the speed, and then we're going to put the radius on a draft size, so 1.2 centimeters maybe. This won't give us enough particles for our final render, but as we're kind of just working through the rig, this will give us a nice amount, but it'll simulate okay in the viewport. So if we then go forward a frame, there is our grid of particles. Let's just go to the display tab of our emitter, to the HUD, show HUD, and up here it's going to say, look, so we've got 100,000 particles. Okay. So that's looking good. Let's bring some physics into the scene then. We're going to go to NeXus. Let's bring in a NeXus gravity, and we'll leave these in the default settings. Now, if we have got, we're going to be using particles that are going to be under 1 centimeter. Let's just go to that emission tab. At the moment, 1.2, but when we get to production levels, we're going to have maybe 3 million particles here, and that means they're going to be quite small, maybe 0.5 centimeters. So it's a good rule of thumb. If you have got strong acceleration forces like full strength gravity and particles that are small, maybe 0.5 centimeters, it's a good idea to increase the X-Particles subframe steps, to divide each frame into smaller parts, so more calculations can be done and there's more accuracy. So what we're going to do, we're going to hold Control and press D to get our Cinema 4D project settings. So look, if you've got a project, this is where you set your frames per second, your color management options, all that stuff. And in the Cinema 4D project settings, there is an X-Particles tab. Let's click here. And what we want to do is increase the default subframe steps is just set to 1. We're going to put this up to, say, 4, because we've got very fast acceleration force with the full strength gravity for particles this size. We're also going to be blasting this with very fast moving water particles. So because of that, because of those very high speeds, we want to break each frame down a bit and have more calculations to make it more accurate. So that's why we're making this subframe steps at 4. Okay, so now that we've got that in, if we hit play, those particles are just going to fall out of the frame. We need to set up our cube as a collision object, obviously. So let's go to the cube floor, go to tags. We're going to go to extensions, INSYDIUM tags, and put on a collider. Now for the grains, we don't need any bounce. We need the friction quite high so the grains don't just spread out as soon as the gravity takes effect. So let's put this friction quite high on maybe 90%. So now when we hit play, there's no physics going on in the scene to make the particles interact with each other. There's just the gravity making them all fall down. But at the moment, the particles don't really even know each other exist. They're just falling down and colliding on that floor. Okay, let's bring in the fluid simulation then. So we'll go to NeXus and we'll bring in an nxFluids. We want this in SPH mode. Fluid type, obviously we want it to be granular. we don't need, because we're going to be doing a simulation where our snow is going to be collapsing straight away as soon as it's hit by the water, we don't actually need this to be able to kind of stand up under its own weight. We're going to fake that. And as a result, we don't need quite as much sub-step accuracy in our fluid solve as you would if you wanted your model to be able to stand up under its own weight. So because of that, we can just maybe increase these sub-steps up to about 6. So we've got 6 sub-steps here, but remember, this is just for the fluid solve, but remember, we have got 4 scene sub-steps on top of that. So effectively, we have got 6 sub-steps per scene sub-step. So in reality, per frame, we've actually got this times 4, haven't we? 6, 12, 18, 24 sub-steps really, because we've added those universal sub-steps to the setup. Let's go down to our granular settings and let's just put our friction up to, say, 90 and our stability on, I don't know, let's say 20. Hit play. And this is going to obviously simulate a bit more slowly now, because now we've got the real physics working with our objects. But you can see, look, our grains are falling apart. Let's just change that display mode so we can see some of that cracking going on. We'll go to the emitter, display, particles. Let's set the color mode to gradient parameter. And then let's set the gradient parameter. We're going to map our gradient to, not age, let's do it to the granular values. Maybe put this down to 30. And this will just be blue to white. I'll leave it on that for now. So here's our grains. Yeah, look, we've got some cracking. It's kind of struggling to stand up under its own weight. And it's falling to the ground. And if we come round, let's come out of this scene camera. You can see that, look, it's cracked here and it's fallen down. Now, because we're at a draft particle count, it seems that our stability at the moment is too great, and this is kept together as a big lump. And if we wanted this to crumble, which we do in our final sim, if we were at this draft particle count, we'd go to the fluids and we'd just decrease this stability so it's able to fall apart more easily. Let's put that on, say, 5, and you'll see that it's less able to retain those really large chunks. It's going to break under its own movement. Look, that's cracked all the way down. His face is cracked off. Look, that looks really cool, doesn't it? That looks excellent. But when we get to the particle resolution with smaller particles that will be actually caching and rendering, this stability amount, my guess, is going to be too small and it'll fall apart too easily, so we may need to increase it. But let's just leave it on this for now. Okay, so that's basically it for our fluids. Now, I've mentioned this before and I'll just point it out again. We are not going to simulate this 100% accurately so that this is able to stand up in its own and only starts collapsing once it gets hit by the water. That would require massive accuracy settings in the sim. It would take an awful long time to cache that accuracy, and we just don't need to be able to do it. We can fake this collapsing and get these nice chunks, and it will remain much more manageable, much easier to art direct. There's no need to go full bore with a full realistic simulation where all of the physics are working as they would in the real world. It's pointless. We need to do ourselves a favour and fake it where we can. So we'll leave it at this. The way we're going to fake this is we're going to go to our gravitational strength. And the only reason this is collapsing is because the gravity is pulling it down. So what we're going to do is say the gravity only starts affecting our statue once the water hits it. That's the trick. And we do that using data mapping of this gravitational strength in our gravity mod. And here's how we do it. We just go to the mapping tab, and what we want to do is we can do it on age, actually. Age work fine. So let's do it on age. And what we want to do is map, the parameter we want to map is the gravity strength, so that's correct. We're mapping it to the age of the particle. Very good. And this is our minimum maximum age range that is in here. So by default, it's saying this is 0 frames old particles. This is 30 frames old particles, here to here. And then on our y-axis is our gravity strength, from 0 strength to full strength. So what this default graph is saying is when the particles are 0 frames old, they have 0 gravitational strength, and as they get older, the gravity strength increases until they get to 30 frames old and they have full gravitational strength. So if we just change this, so the minimum is say 28 and the maximum is 30, the gravitational strength will go from 0 to full over this 2-frame period between age 28 and 30. So let's have a look at that. Hit play, no gravitational strength at all. It's just they're static, and that's fine. And then we'll time this to come on. Here we come, frame 28, and now there's the gravity and it starts to collapse. So we can just control the collapse that way. And what we need to do is time this range min and max to coincide with when our fluid particles hits our grains. And that is the way that we can fake this, still get what looks like a really realistic, nice, physically accurate sim, but we can fake it so we don't need it to be able to kind of stand up under its own weight with those kind of excessive settings that will make it take a lot longer to cache. Okay, cool. So we've got the basis of our granular sim. Let's just switch off that map for now because we don't know when the water's going to hit it yet. We haven't set that up. So now that we've got the basis of our snow or sand setup, what we'll do is introduce our new emitter, which will be our liquid. So let's just rename this. Actually, let's get a bit organized here. So here is our emitter. Let's just rename this one emitter granular. And now we want to bring in a new emitter that's going to be our liquid. So let's go to our emitters folder and we'll create emitter. And this one, let's call it emitter liquid. And in this one, we want this one to be off camera, and it's going to come in. Let's just make our bust visible so we can see what's happening. We want this to be camera right and kind of flowing in and smashing into it. So with our emitter liquid, let's just move it up here. Here's our default emitter, and we are going to create a box actually. So let's go to the object tab, and the emitter shape we're going to set to box. And we want this to be kind of, a thin box, which is going to give us a nice flow of fluid. Let's put this on maybe 17 centimeters tall, something like that is looking good. And what we want is we want the fluid to be all shooting out from this box in this direction, which would be the -x, look this way. So we can do direction minus x-axis, and then it's going to be going that way. Cool. And then let's go to our coordinates on this, and we want to bring it kind of somewhere off screen, maybe 455, and the height, we want it quite close to the ground, something, I don't know, maybe something like that. That looks good. And then we want to tilt this downwards so that the x-axis is pointing down, so it splashes down on the floor and then moves along our floor to hit our statue. So let's just put this bank setting on maybe, I don't know, -25. Yeah, that looks good. Okay, let's go to the emission tab. We want this to be in hex mode. Now it's very important, because we're going to be doing this fluid simulation with our nxFluids. We are in SPH mode, which gives us the choice of fluid types, granular or liquid. In SPH mode, you have to have exactly the same radius particles in your simulation, otherwise it'll cause instability. So our water particles have to be the same radius as our granular particles. So let's just go to our emitter granular. What was our draft size? It was 1.2. So let's just do that with our emitter liquid. Our size is 1.2. And we want loads of speed. We want these really kicking across here pretty quick. Let's maybe put a 800 speed. Okay, so if I start simulating now with these settings, our liquid particles are just going to calculate as if they were grains. Let's go to our fluids, because we've got it set to granular. But we need the same fluids object to solve for both fluid types. Otherwise, the granular and the liquid won't be able to interact. We need them to interact with each other. So here's how we do it. We use a tag to say that this is liquid, and this one will then solve as grains. So the way we do that, let's go to our emitter liquid emitter, go to tags, extensions, INSYDIUM tags, put an nxFluids tag on there, and in here, in our SBH folder, our fluid type is set to liquid, and we'll leave just everything default. So that is saying, even though our nxFluids object, which is like the master controls, even though that is set to granular, for our liquid emitter, it'll ignore that and it'll solve this as liquid particles. Brilliant. There's one last thing that we need to do. If I just switch off my granular emitter, if I hit play now, we're going to get particles being born within the volume of our box, and then the next frame we're going to get loads more particles, and then they're going to get born on top of each other, and that is going to create like an explosive blast of particles because of the way in which the fluid sim works. You see, it's because the particles are being born on top of each other, it's creating this really kind of high pressure situation, and they're blasting out. We don't want that. So the way we alleviate this problem but pump as many particles as possible into the scene is, in our fluids, we go to our check density and switch this on. And what this is saying is, if a new particle is born and its fluid density is greater than 110% of the fluid density in the scene, it will be killed. And that stops them creating this high fluid density, high pressure situation. Let's just leave it on the defaults and see if it's fixed our problem. Yeah, so now we've got that fluid flowing and moving towards our bust. Brilliant. Let's just go to our emitter liquid, display options, and let's just put this on gradient parameter, and we'll map the gradient here to the, let's do speed, which is good for liquids, and I'll just do it in auto. All right, so now we have got our two fluid types. Now here is something that's worth considering. We have got our cube floor collider tag set with very high friction to make sure that our sand particles can grip that floor nicely and don't just get washed away. But that's cool, but we don't really want our fluids to have that much, our liquids, sorry, to have that much friction on our floor. So this is what we're going to do to alleviate that problem. We are going to make a duplicate of this floor. Let's call this one floor granular, and in the floor granular we are going to say we only want this floor and this collider to affect our granular particles. So how do we stop the liquid particles being affected by this collider tag? We go to the tag, look, we've got an exclusions tab. Let's go to that and let's exclude the liquid particles from the granular collisions. Okay, cool, so that'll no longer work, but now we need to bring in a new floor that the liquid ones will work on but the granular won't. So let's just hold control and make a copy of that floor, and this one, let's rename it and we'll call this one floor liquid, not capitals, let's keep it consistent, liquid. Okay, and on floor liquid we need to take out that from our exclusions folder because we want to include the liquid but disclude the granular emitter. Okay, and the reason we've done that is in our liquid floor we can go to the collision settings and put our friction way down. Let's put that on maybe 10%. And now the water will be able to slide really easily across this because we want it to kind of gush and slide and blast into our sand particles. Let's just hit play, and there we're getting something like this, and that's looking cool. I think we could even go with less friction. Let's put that friction on maybe 1%. Really make it slidey. Yeah, that's better. That's what I want. That's looking good. Very cool. Okay, so now we have two things set up. Now that we've done that, let's just make the bust invisible. Let's reactivate our granular emitter, and now if this is working correctly, we should get our simulation. There's one thing that we need to address actually, and let's just sim first, and then I'll point out this important part that we're going to have to add. So this is obviously going to take longer because now we've got our fluid and we've got our grains. The gravity is always active because we switched off that mapping, but now, yeah, look, we're getting the interaction between the fluid particles. Look at this really nice splash, that's looking great, and it's collapsing and moving and pushing that all around. That looks really cool. What we could do is add a little bit of movement to the emission of these water particles, the liquid particles, just by animating this emitter slightly. We do that with a vibrate tag. Let's just get that set up. I'm just going to switch off those granular ones. Let's go to our emitter liquid, go to tags. We're going to bring in a animation tag and a vibrate. And in that vibrate, we're going to set regular pulse. We're going to enable rotation, and we just want it to kind of rotate back and forth a bit on the heading. Let's put just maybe 5 degrees with a frequency of 1, so it's not that fast. And just so we can see this happening, let's just switch off the emission completely. We'll just go to the liquid emission. Let's just temporarily put the emission on controlled only so we get no particles, but we'll just see there, look, you can see that twisting nicely. That's just going to give us a little bit of interest in that flow of liquid. So in the emission, let's put that back to hexagonal mode, and let's just hit play. And it's just going to give us a little bit of movement in that, and we'll get a little bit of interesting swirling here. It's a subtle change, but that's going to look cool. Okay, so what is the issue? Now that we have got this set up, we have one gravity object which isn't mapped yet because we switched off that map. Let's put the map back on, so gravity mapping. Let's reactivate that age map so it happens at frame 2830. We need it to, we'll time it with when the liquid hits, but we'll leave it on that for now. But the problem is that now the liquid also has no gravity until frame 28, and that's just not going to work. We're not going to get a proper flow of liquid because we need gravity in the scene for the physics to work properly. So what we're going to do is do 2 different gravity modifiers as well, like we have done 2 collision objects. So let's get that sorted. In this one, this is our mapped gravity. So this is the gravity for our granular. So let's put granular. And what we want is we don't want our liquid particles to be affected by this gravity granular. So to exclude that, we go to the emitter in question, emitter liquid, we go to the modifiers tab, and we're going to drag in gravity granular. And this little minus means that it will ignore this modifier, which is what we want. Cool. Now let's duplicate that gravity. This gravity is going to be for our liquid, so let's rename it liquid. This liquid gravity, we don't want this to be data mapped. We just want it active for the liquid all the time. So let's go to the mapping, and we'll just delete that map out. And then what we need to be careful that in our emitter granular, our snow or sand particles, that these particles ignore the gravity liquid. So let's go to the emitter granular, modifiers, and drag in the gravity liquid. So it's ignoring that. So now both emitters have their own gravity objects and their own collision objects. Fantastic. Cool. Okay, so now we need to make the decision, when do we want our gravity granular to switch on and make this collapse? And we want it to coincide when we get a nice flow of liquid. So for now, let's go to our gravity granular and switch off that map again so it's on all the time. And let's just play this through and time it. So here we go. In fact, sorry, I made a mistake there. Really, we should switch off this gravity completely, shouldn't we? Let's just switch this granular one off. We don't want it crumbling. We want to just time when it gets hit by our fluid. So here we go, and it's hitting, and we don't want it to be the exact frame. We want it to be able to do a bit of damage. So maybe there we activate our gravity. So at 24, we get this really nice splash. It's destroyed. If we make that liquid emitter invisible, it's cut into it, look here. So at this point, we can then get that gravity to come into effect. So let's go to our gravity granular, switch it on, go to our map, switch it on, and we want to say maybe between 23 and 25, those frames, that's when our gravity activates. So let's make our liquid visible again, and we'll go from the beginning. Let's have a look. And this is starting to look, you can see that the effect is really starting to work. This is looking great. So we get it bashing, it's creating a splash, and then we're getting the gravity coming into effect, and it's starting to move down. That's looking really cool. And to time this properly and to make sure that we get this effect lined up and looking really good, I would urge you to do a couple of hardware renders of it in maybe slightly different points, and that is when you will be able to judge if you got the falling of that object timed correctly. If you activate the gravity too quickly, you're not going to get a nice kind of big splash before it starts to crumble. If you activate the gravity too late, the physics will look weird, and it'll look like your sculpture is kind of hovering a little bit before it then starts to drop. So it's important to get this timing correct. But for me, that looked like it was fractionally too late, the dropping of that object. So I'm going to go to my gravity granular, and I'm going to set this down to 21 and 23, and we'll just go through one more time, but you get the idea. You need to go back and forth, have a look, preferably render something out in low settings so you get an idea of how the physics are playing in real time. But yeah, this is looking nice. We're getting this nice splash, and then it's starting to fall, and that's looking really cool. Some nice cracking going on, nice big splash. This is looking brilliant. Excellent. Okay, so we have got our basic scene set up. It's all looking really good, and we are in our kind of our draft settings here with not that many particles. Let's just have a look at how many particles we've got actually, just for interest's sake. We'll go to our emitter granular, display mode, HUD, show HUD, and we've got, so it was 100,000 particles for our sculpture, and then in our emitter liquid on frame 49, if we go to the HUD, show HUD, and we've got 250,000 particles. Now, before we increase this to our more kind of production resolution and particles, quantity and size, we actually need to stop this water emitting, because if we go to our scene camera, we only really want the blast of water to affect it, to make this crumble, and then to stop emitting. So actually, I'm going to say, just by chance, we've stopped this on frame 49. I would say that around here, we can stop that emission of water. We've got our crumble. It'll continue to crumble. We've still got a bit of a blast, which will move it around, and that's going to be enough. So we need to stop our liquid emission around here. So let's go to our emitter liquid emission tab. By default, it'll just keep emitting, because we've got emit all frames here. Look, it'll just keep emitting for the whole scene. So let's just uncheck that and say emit from frame 0 to frame, what we're on, 49 for 50, and then that water will stop emitting. So if I hit play, it'll stop emitting, and we'll get this kind of residual bit of particle emission, which is still splashing and moving around, and it'll kind of move our snow, and as this snow kind of falls down, it creates more splashes, and this is looking really cool, isn't it? Next, you've got the emission ending, and the last bit will force its way through, and we're getting this really nice movement. This is going to be great. I'm very excited about this. Okay, so now that we've got that, let's go back back to the first frame. We'll go to our emitter liquid. Let's go to our display tab, switch off that show HUD. So we've got our basic setup. What you could do at this point, as I say, is cache this out and do a hardware render to make sure it's okay. We're going to miss out that. And now we're going to move on and make this much higher particle resolution to get something that's going to look good at render time. So we're going to go to our emitter granular first. Let's just switch off the liquid for now. And in the emitter granular, we're going to go to the emission. So we get more particles in our scene in hexagonal mode, obviously by reducing our particle radius. This has an impact on the fluid sim, so we need to make those tweaks as well. So the radius, we're going to go down to, say, let's try 0.4, and we're going to go forward 1 frame. And this will take a longer to initialize because we're going to be in the millions of particles now. But when we get our granular particles in our scene, we'll then go to our display, to the HUD, and just find out exactly how many particles that is going to give us with these settings. So there we go. You can see already it's way more detailed. Let's go to our display, HUD, show HUD, and look, just under 3 million. Okay, so that's going to do us, I think, for our particle resolution. Now, one thing to note is the amount of particles that you are able to simulate using NeXus, using your GPU, is dependent on your graphics card and your VRAM. And when you're simulating fluids, it's much more computationally heavy. So if you're simulating fluids, you will be able to simulate fewer kind of max particles on your system than if you were just doing particles with turbulence. So it's, with experience, you just need to kind of know what are the limits for your system. With the graphics card that I'm using, it's got 24 gig of VRAM, and I know that I am able to simulate around 13-14 million particles with kind of heavy fluid calculations with that setup. So I know that this amount, 3 million particles, is going to be for my sculpture, and then we need perhaps 5 million, maybe 6 million for the fluids. And that's going to be within the capabilities of my setup. All right, so let's have a look. We've got our 3 million particles for that. So then we have to make sure that our liquid particles match in radius are granular. Otherwise, the fluid simulation won't work and it'll be explosive. So let's go to our liquid emission and put this down to 0.4 as well. All right. And now we're ready to kind of simulate at this much higher particle count. So what I want to do at this point, obviously things are going to run more slowly. There's so many millions of more calculations taken on, even on the GPU. When we're doing these granular scenes, it's going to take longer. But I want to make sure that the timings of our gravity is activating at a good time in our simulation now that simulation has changed. So the way we're going to do that is just by caching some of the scene, not the whole scene. So we've got this set to just 120 frames. I'm going to put this down to 50 on my timeline. So it's only, in fact, we don't even need to do 50. Let's do 40 frames, because we know that the point at which the liquid hits the sand is around frame 22-ish. So this is going to give us enough cached frames to see whether the timing of that gravity mapping is good for the simulation now that we're at a higher particle count. Before we start caching, let's just go to our fluids, go to our granular settings, because remember, with the larger, lower particle count scene, we massively reduced the stability of that granular sculpture so it could break apart into smaller pieces. The chunks were too big. Now we're at tiny particles with lots more of them. We need the stability setting to be bigger to get the same kind of size chunks. So I'm going to just put this at 20. And go for that in our first cache, and let's see what this is going to look like. So we're going to cache this out now. So let's go to utilities, cache, and I've got compress cache on build. I'm just caching it to my documents. I'm going to build cache. So we're just going to do 40 frames. So what I'll do is I'll pause it here, come back to you when it's finished. I'll see how long it took, and we'll have a look and see whether our timings are correct. Okay, and that cache is done, and it took just over 13 minutes to do that. So here we go. Let's just make a couple of changes here. What you'll find, if we just go to that cache object, you'll see that we have got it's a 12 gig cache for only 40 frames. So there's a lot of information here. What we want to do is make this as light as possible in our viewport so we get the best playback. So let's do a couple of things. First of all, we'll go to our emitter granular. Let's go to the display HUD, switch off that HUD, and then we'll go to, look, let's highlight both of our emitters. Go to the display tab, particles tab. Let's change the editor display to dots. We can force display, so even though it's cached, it'll then redraw those as dots, which is a lighter drawing method. And let's reduce the level of detail, so it's not having to draw in all of those millions of particles, just a few to give us an idea. Let's put that level of detail down to maybe, I don't know, 21%. Okay, so here we have our scene, and if we play this through, you'll see obviously we're not going to get real-time playback because there's just so many gigabytes of data it's having to load in every frame. But here comes our liquid, and it's crashing into our sand, it's breaking it apart, our sand or snow, and then we're getting our gravity activating. Yeah, so that movement for me is looking quite nice. Now, obviously, you can't get a proper idea of this until you see this in real time. So I would urge you at this point to do a hardware render to make sure that that sim is looking good. And if you need to make adjustments after looking at the hardware render, then make those adjustments and recache. But for me, this is looking really good. I'm pleased with that. So now we need to think about what do we need to get this cached up for the full scene, and also what elements do we need at render time. So what we could do, let's put our timeline back to 120 frames. So we've got the full timeline, and what we need is a couple of elements. Now, we could cache this at this point and then think about meshing after we have cached. There's different kind of approaches, or you could sort out your meshes for both the liquid and the granular particles now and cache everything together, or you can leave your meshes uncached and just use the cached particles and render the mesh live. There's a few different options. What we're going to do is we're going to cache this entire scene first of just particles, and then with our cached particles, we're then going to introduce setting up our meshing. So I can go through the meshing settings with you, and it'll load in a bit more quickly because it won't have to simulate the particles. So let's get that sorted. So we have increased our frame count up to 120. That's how many we're going to be doing for our scene. So everything should be the same. Everything, we're not making any tweaks. I'm pleased with those settings. So we're going to go to our cache settings, and we're just going to build cache, going to overwrite. So there's our dialog. We're going to overwrite the existing cache, and that's going to cache through now. So I'll pause it here and come back to you when this is done, and we'll start meshing these two particle types. And that cache is done. It took about 2 hours and 40 minutes for 120 frames. And if we just come forward, now we're going to get, even with our display settings, we're not going to get real-time playback, obviously, because we've got millions of particles in this scene. But here we've got, look, on frame 18, our fluid is making its way into our sculpture, breaking it apart, that it's cracking. The gravity is kicked in here, so we're getting the drop, getting some nice cracking happening. And the water is continuing, and this is looking good. Some nice splash detail happening here. Let's go forward a bit, and then the sculpture really starts to break apart, and as that falls down, it encourages some other big splashing. So we've got some really nice looking effects here. And remember, we're not looking at the full particle count here in the viewport. Let's just have a look at what particles we've got. So remember, we've got 3 million, just under 3 million snow. Let's have a look at the fluid particles. On frame 50, when our emission stops, so we don't get any more liquid ones after this, let's go to our liquid emitter, and let's go to our display HUD and show HUD. and we've got lots, look, 6 million particles. So we've got 9 million particles in total. And we're going to get some nice detail from this. Okay, so now we've got that and it's looking good. We need to think about, let's just switch off that hood. We need to think about meshing these particles for our render. So let's start by meshing our, let's just do our granular particles first. So we'll switch off the liquid ones and we'll come back to a frame nearer the beginning, and we need to bring in a mesher. So let's go to our generators and we're going to bring in a generator open VDB mesher, and let's call this one open VDB mesher granular. And we need to go to the general tab, general, and we need to drag in whatever object or emitter we want to mesh. So let's drag in our granular particles. Now we have got a very large voxel size here, and that means that we have very little detail and definition in this mesh. We don't have enough voxel detail. If I hit NB to show the lines of that that mesh, NB, there we go. You can see that it's not a very detailed mesh, so we don't have enough. Let's go back to our mesher then, and we need to increase this voxel size. So the voxel detail, we increase the detail by reducing the voxel size. Obviously, smaller voxels means more voxels can fit within our volume. So let's put this on maybe, I don't know, 0.5. We want this to be pretty detailed. So down to 0.5 is going to massively increase the detail. This is going to take a couple of seconds to calculate, and then we're going to see a much more kind of defined object, but it's still going to look a little bit bloated. There we go. So obviously we've got loads more detail there, but it's bloated. It looks like bulbous, doesn't it? And that's because if we come down to our point options, by default each particle has its radius multiplied by 10, and that gives the kind of the spherical blob that surrounds each particle, and that's just way too much. So let's put this down to maybe 1.9, and again it's going to have to recalculate. Yeah, okay, so now that's looking pretty cool. Now you may think obviously it's looking very bumpy, and you can see the obvious gridding effect of our particles here, but actually because we're rendering this with our snow material, which we'll go into in a bit, and it has subsurface scattering, it has a smoothing effect, and actually we're not really going to see much of this. We'll do a little bit of smoothing now at mesh time though, but not as much as you may think when we're doing our snow material. So let's just get that sorted. We're going to go up to filters and we're going to activate filters. Now by default we have a median filter, which we're not going to use, so I'm just going to delete that one out, and we're going to bring in, I like to use the curvature with fluids, and our curvature filter, if you want any more strength than the 100, we can just increase this iterations. One's the default. Let's put this on 2 iterations. That's going to increase the smoothing, and that is all we're going to have to do for this smoothing. As I say, when we put our snow material on here that has the kind of the volume scattering, it's going to smoothen this out anyway, and that is going to be absolutely perfect for us. So let's get that done. Actually, whilst we're here, we may as well do that. We'll go to our material manager and let's double click to make a new Redshift material, and we're going to put this on our granular, and let's just call this one granular, just to stay organized. Okay, and we can go to our Redshift render view, start rendering, and we're going to get our render of our particles. All right, so what we're going to do is our subsurface scattering trick here. So let's double click on our granular material and we'll just make a little bit of room. We're not going to do a really in-depth material with kind of lots of nuanced bumps and normals. We're just going to do a very basic one, but you can take this basic setup and add more depth and nuance to it. once we get the basics right, it's kind of 90% there to get the look. So what we're going to do is come down to our subsurface scattering section, and we're going to put the weight on 1, which pretty much overrides everything else. And we have this, now we have this nice material that's scattering light, but it's looking a little bit too opaque, isn't it? So we're going to make some adjustments. First of all, we're going to change our scattering color, and we're going to put just a hint of a blue in there, which may seem a little strong at the moment, but we'll tamp this down. So that's looking nice. And then what we're going to do is we're going to hugely increase this scale up to, maybe this is how far the light is able to penetrate and scatter within the volumes. Let's put this on a huge amount, let's say 100, and we lose that color. It's just the light's passing all the way through it. But then what we'll do is we'll use our radius with a grayscale value just to kind of just to tamp that down a bit. So let's click on this, and we'll just increase this until you can see, yeah, that's looking nice. We're getting the light coming from this side, it's penetrating, and you can start seeing that little suggestion of that blue tint. That's looking really nice. I'm just going to leave that there. That is fine. We're not going to do anything more. I'm happy with that. Okay, very nice. Let's just turn that off, and we can stop that rendering and turn that one off as well. Excellent. Right, so we have got our OpenVDB mesher of our granular particles sorted, so that's ready to go. Now let's have a look at meshing our liquid. So let's go to our OpenVDB mesher granular, and we can just make a copy of this for our liquid mesh. So hold Control, drag this down, let's make a copy, and then this one we'll just rename it, and we're going to call it mesher liquid, obviously. Okay, and we can remove this texture tag from that because we don't need that. And in our new one, our liquid, let's go to the General tab. Let's go to the General tab here. We don't want to be meshing our granular particles, obviously. Let's delete that out. And we'll drag in our liquid particles. Now, we are going to have to be patient when it comes to meshing this liquid simulation. We have 6 million odd particles, which is a massive amount of particles to then have to mesh. So I'll warn you now, the setup of this is going to take a little while, and it takes a while for each frame to calculate. But we have got our settings from our granular mesh because we just duplicated it. One thing is we are not going to need this voxel resolution for our liquids as we did with our grains. We don't need that much detail. I know that for now. So even before we switch this on, I'm just going to increase that voxel size up to maybe 0.6 from 0.5. And I know that's going to be fine. And also, because we're going to do a little bit more aggressive filtering on the liquid than we did on the grains, the liquid needs to be a bit more smooth. So what we're going to do is go to our filters, we're going to go to our curvature filter, and we're going to increase these iterations. Let's put these up to, say, 10 iterations. So because of that, because we're applying more filtering, more smoothing, let's go back to our General tab. We just want to give it a little bit more volume, a bit more depth, and we can do that by increasing, remember, that point radius amount, that number that multiplies by the particle radius. So we did this for the grains for our sculpture. So let's put it up by 2, which up to 2, sorry, which just gives us a little bit more volume, which means we can then apply some heavier filtering without the kind of mesh disappearing in the thinner parts. Okay, so now we've got those basic settings. Let's activate our liquid particles in the viewport, and there we've got our liquid particles. And now what we're going to do is activate our liquid mesh. Let's click this on. Now this isn't going to be instantaneous. As I said, we have got over 6 million particles here. Each one is having a kind of a volume calculated around its radius by this point radius amount with a very fine mesh. Here it is. And then we have got 10 curvature iterations smoothing this out. And what we have got here is looking pretty good. And what we're looking out for is we want as kind of smooth detail as possible in the kind of chunky parts, but we don't want that smoothing so aggressive that we lose these nice splashes of mesh and of particles. So this is looking pretty decent. If it turns out that too much of the mesh has disappeared and there's too many particles that don't have a mesh, then you would need to do one of two things: either reduce the voxel size back down to bring in more detail, or increase the point radius a little more, which means that you've got more volume and it means that it's more likely that the particles will be meshed. But I think this is looking pretty decent actually. We've got a best of both worlds here, some nice smoothness and some kind of fine detail in the noisy parts. So we won't really know until we get rendering this. So let's make a basic liquid material for our mesh. We'll double click. Let's call this one liquid, and this one is going to be the most bog standard liquid material we can do. We're going to drag this onto our liquid mesh. I'm going to double click that to bring up our node editor. It's just going to load the viewport preview before that pops up, so let's just give it a second whilst it does that. There we go. And now that we've done that, let's open up our node editor. Let's go back to our Redshift render view. All right, and we'll just start rendering that and it'll load in that mesh. So there we've got our kind of grayscale fluid, got these nice kind of ripples as it's bursting and sliding its way along. So now we need to make this into a water material, and again, this isn't going to be the most advanced water material. It's going to be very basic, but of course from this starting point you can add to it should you wish. But all we're going to do is a couple of things. In our reflections, we're going to change the IOR to the correct index of refraction for water, 1.33. And then in the transmission, we're going to put this onto full transmission. We're going to put our roughness in our reflections. I've missed that actually. Look, we need to put the roughness down to virtually 0. I always like to leave a tiny bit in. Now what you could do is add some depth with a scatter color. You could also add some dispersion should you wish, but for us I'm just going to leave this standard as is, and this is looking really nice. Some nice reflections here. Okay, so now that we've got that, that's looking good. I'm happy with that. So let's close that down. Let's close down that render view. So now we are ready to do one of two things. We can either recache this scene and cache our meshes from our cached particles, and if you do that, obviously you have everything cached then, so the render itself will be much quicker if you cache the mesh now. We could just render this now with our meshes live, but the rendering will take a lot longer because it's got to load in the particles, then it's got to generate the mesh, then it's got to do all of the render settings. So you can't really shortcut it. You have to spend that time at some point. So I would always urge you to cache where possible, unless you're really pushed for time. So what I'm going to do is just that. We are going to activate, let's go back to the first frame because we don't need all of this active in the viewport. We're going to activate our emitter granular. We're going to activate our mesher granular. So now both of those things are active. We've got both our cached liquid and granular particles ready to play, and then we have got our live granular and liquid meshes. So all we need to do to cache our meshes along with our already cached particles is this: go to our cache object, we want to build cache, but here's the important bit: do not hit overwrite, because then it will recache and resimulate your particles. There's no need to do that, they're already cached. If we hit continue, it will ignore the particles, it won't try and recache them, it will read them from the cache, but it will cache our meshes for each. So that's what we want to do. So we're going to hit continue and we'll leave this caching. I'm guessing it's going to take around an hour to an hour and a half maybe, but we will have a look. I'll pause it now and come back when it's finished. All right, and that cache is done, and that took an hour and 20 minutes to get those meshes cached up. And now that is done, we have the advantage of we can actually switch off our emitter liquid and our emitter granular. Because we're only rendering the meshes, we no longer need to load these into the scene anymore, so we're going to get much better feedback in our viewport. So let's just go forward to, say, frame 8, and here we have our bust. So we'll just have a look at what our render's looking like. Let's go to Redshift render view, and we'll just make this a little bigger. Hit play. All right, so we've got our water just starting to creep in and encroach on our bust. Let's go forward a few more frames as that water makes its way. We've got these really nice ripples in the water. This is looking really nice. Now we've got some splashing as the water hits up around the base of our bust. A little bit further on in the scene, and it's starting to destroy that bust. We're getting some nice splashing here. This is starting to look very nice indeed. I'm pleased with this. Let's move forward a little bit more. This is looking excellent. One thing to note is my bust is looking slightly too I think this is looking a little bit shiny, and I want to dull this down a little bit to make it look a little bit less like ice and a bit more like kind of a hard packed snow sculpture. If we come back to some of the earlier frames, you can see it's looking quite shiny, isn't it? So let's go to our granular material, and in our standard node all we need to do is just increase the roughness, and it's just going to, yeah, that's more of a look that I'm after, even a bit more. So that's looking pretty cool. Excellent. Right, let's come right to one of the last frames. Okay, and let's load that in. And it's all spread out. The liquid's moved everywhere, completely collapsed, and I'm very pleased with this. This is looking excellent. Right, so we're ready to do a render of this now. So let's get that set up. We'll switch that off. Let's go to our render settings, and we're going to go to let's do, oh, do you know what? Let's do this at 1080p. And we're going to go and render all frames, frame 1 to frame 120 is what we'll do. Now let's go to Redshift for our render settings. So in our sampling, we're in advanced here. In our sampling, we've just got our unified sampling set quite high actually here. 0.1 is going to allow quite a lot of noise, and that's not going to be good enough quality for us. So what we're going to do is put that down to maybe 0.2. Let's go to our denoising, and we're not going to actually have denoising in this. So I've got this disabled. Because denoising is disabled, we're going to activate our random noise pattern. We want that in so we get realistic film-like noise. Okay, and actually 0.2 is not correct. That's a mistake. It needs to be 0.02. So the lower the number here, the better quality the render, but the longer it will take. We did have it on 0.1, which I would say is kind of like a draft setting, really. We're going to put this on 0.02, so much better quality than what we had been working with. And the only other thing we're going to do is we're going to go to System, and I'm going to go with a bucket size of 512. And if you have enough VRAM to be able to have these large bucket sizes, you'll get a faster render, especially if you're working with one graphics card. It's a good idea. Okay, that's looking good. So let's go to our output. 1 to 20, correct frame rate. That's looking good. Okay, so what we'll do is we're going to render this to the picture viewer, and I'll come back to you when that's done. So that render is finished. It took just over 1 hour to complete, and we've loaded up our EXR sequence into After Effects. Now the only reason we've done this is there are no kind of color correction changes gone on here, but what we have done is put an adjustment layer above our EXR sequence, and on that adjustment layer we have a pixel motion blur effect, and that can be found if we go to the effects, go to the time effects, and then use pixel motion blur. Now in that we have got the default settings. Actually, the only thing we've changed is we've increased the shutter samples to 20 because there are some quite fast moving particles in this, and so it just alleviates any motion blur stepping. Okay, so we've got our render looking really good. Let's have a look at the final animation. We've got our water coming in, it collapses, and it's looking brilliant. I'm really pleased with that. So let's just have a look at some of the areas that we were concerned about. Remember that at the start of this, we didn't have the gravity active on our model, and that's so we didn't have to have ridiculously high granular settings to get this to stand up, but then we had to activate that gravity when the fluid hit. And you can see that the fluid starts to break it apart, and then when that gets crushed, it starts moving downwards, and that to my eye looks perfect. It doesn't look like it's static and then has the gravity switched on. That fits in perfectly, so we managed to time that really well. The water hitting the bottom of our model here looks great, the way it kind of breaks apart, and then as it drops, there's further cracking. Look at that crack right across the top, and then that causes a kind of a secondary splash of the water. That's looking great. And then I really love how the last bit of water comes in here and we get this last big splash over the top. So that is looking really good. I'm very pleased with that indeed. Now, of course, we just used this Cinema 4D bust model because everyone's got access to it, but you can use whatever model you want. It could be a logo for a motion graphics shot, it could be a character, whatever it is that you like. But that is how we mix two different fluid types, granular and liquid, and how with some incredibly basic materials on each we can get something that looks really good. So I hope you enjoyed that one, and I'll very much look forward to seeing what you do with this technique.